Good morning, all. It's the stroke of 10 a.m. here in the Pacific Northwest. That's where I am. So I see people joining. I'll give it just a moment or two for people to join, keep joining, and then we'll get started with our webinar here. I do want to go ahead and invite folks. It's always nice to know who's in the virtual room. So if you want to use the chat function to say hi and let us know where you're tuning in from, I recognize people are probably coming from a lot of different time zones. So thanks for joining. Welcome, Chris from Portland, Oregon. I'm going to assume. Welcome. Oh, look at this, Austria. Welcome, welcome. This is so exciting. Great to see you all. Salt Lake City, I love this. Well, I think I'm going to go ahead and just kick us off so we can get going and have a great conversation this morning. So yes, awesome to see you all using the chat function. Please feel free to use that. And then we have the Q&A function if you have questions. We are very much trying to structure this as a conversation and an opportunity to answer questions and have discussion. My name is Amanda Howell. I am a researcher with the Urbanism Next Center at the University of Oregon. I have been doing some work on looking at shared micromobility programs across the country. And one of the things that I got really interested in as I was kind of learning more about all these different programs and who manages them and who oversees them is the role that regional agencies play in helping shape and manage micromobility across the US. And I felt like for me, that was something that, I've heard much more about what the role that cities play, local jurisdictions, but that it felt like a great opportunity to have a conversation with folks who are managing micromobility at the regional level and doing excellent work. So I'm really excited this morning to be joined by Sabrina Bradbury from the Sacramento Council of Governments and Emily Lindsay, who's with the Denver Council of Governments. And the way we're going to structure it this morning is they both have some information that they will present, and then we will have a conversation, and we will invite everyone to go ahead and post their questions, and look forward to seeing what's on your mind with regards to how regional agencies can and do manage shared micromobility. So with that, I will go ahead and pass it over to Sabrina to kick us off.
Thanks, Amanda. I'm so excited to be here. Bikeshare and shared micromobility is one of my favorite topics. So let me just share my screen here and we'll get started. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of how SACOG came into managing our regional bikeshare program, and then touch on some of the evolution of shared micromobility, how national trends and really global trends have played out in our region locally, and the role we continue to play in bikeshare and shared micromobility, and then talk about some of the benefits of taking a regional approach to bikeshare and shared micromobility. So how it started in our region was back in 2012, taking you back about a decade, probably longer actually. Some partners started talking about how do we get bikeshare launched in our region. And we had a local air district, some of our cities, some universities, transit agencies that all started coming together on and hired a consultant to develop a business plan for launching bikeshare in the region. And then the Sacramento Metropolitan Air Quality Management District went after a grant in one of the SACOG funding rounds, and they secured that in 2013. And then about 2015, the Air District approached SACOG and asked if we might be interested in taking over the management of the bikeshare grant. And they still wanted to be involved in the project, but they were really, excuse me, they were really seeing that a more regional approach was needed, and some of the expertise that SACOG already had in being a council of governments was going to be useful in managing this grant project and getting it launched. We're a 6-county region. We have 22 cities and 32 board members. And so we already have expertise in convening partners and consensus building. And so it really made sense in their mind to have SACOG, who could take a more holistic view to planning a bike share system, take on the role of managing that. And then we also already specialize in bringing planning and data collection and analysis to discussions and decision makings, both with our board and other partners. And so we agreed to take on the management of that. And so I'll give you a kind of timeline since then of our bike share system and some of the trends we've seen. So in 2016, we released an RFP, working jointly with 3 cities, Davis, Sacramento, and West Sacramento, to launch a bike share system. We procured SOBI, social bicycles, and when about the time we were going to launch in 2018, Uber purchased SOBI, and we were able to launch an all-electric assist bike share system. And then about that same time, there were some companies that were starting to offer bike share for free and coming into cities without any public subsidy. And so we did sort of retool our contract with Uber before launching. And then we were starting to see e-scooters come on the scene later in 2018. And bike share operators were starting to shift over to e-scooters because they were saying that it just penciled better for them financially. The operations and capital costs of scooters were cheaper for them. And so we were continuing to see sort of a lot of disruption in the marketplace, but we had, despite all that, we had an amazing year in 2019. We were Jump's second top market globally in terms of total trips, coming in second after Paris. And so it was really, we thought bike share would be successful, but we were really just surprised and really amazed at how much the ridership had grown in just a year and a half. But we also, had e-scooters coming into the space. And so we started talking a bit about, well, what's that going to mean for our bike share system? West Sacramento and Sacramento developed some local ordinances that launched in 2019 to allow scooter operators to come in and pay fees. So we kind of had these 2 separate things happening where SACOG and the cities were managing a regional bike share program that had some public investment in bike parking. We didn't own any of the bikes or pay the operator at all, but we still had that staff time and public investment of the bike rack infrastructure. And then we had this private companies coming in with scooters. And we were continuing to see a lot of consolidation and contraction of bike share systems. And then, of course, the pandemic hit in early 2020. And then by mid-2020, Uber had already pulled all the fleet, all the operators, weren't operating since March of 2020, but by May, they had transferred their operations over to Lime. And so we, again, we're kind of going through this disruption, and then we negotiated a subsidy and revenue sharing deal with Lime to relaunch bikes, recognizing that the finances behind them were different than the private sector originally thought, where they thought they could make these systems pencil. That was clearly playing out to not be the case, where we were seeing a lot of operators no longer offering bike share and pulling out of a lot of markets. So we did relaunch bike share, and a number of scooter operators are now back in Sacramento and West Sacramento. We have launched in Sacramento and West Sacramento since 2021. And we're working with the city of Davis, as they do not currently allow scooters, to see what we might be able to do there for a pilot that is maybe bikes only, or if they're wanting to do a mixed fleet of some kind. And so this is all leading up to a point at which we're sort of reassessing the Bikeshare system and the structure that we have in place. And we have, I believe, about 4 operators in West Sacramento and Sacramento. 3 of them that are just scooters, and then Lime that has scooters and bikes. And so we're exploring the potential of looking at a regional approach to shared micromobility overall. So I want to kind of close out with a bit on some of the benefits that I've touched on throughout the presentation, but just to emphasize the role of a regional approach. And to be clear, it doesn't mean that it needs to be a council of governments. I think that systems could be set up, a nonprofit or a city being the lead, but still have a regional approach that is collaborative and inclusive of other partners that might be involved in wanting to have bike share or shared micromobility. But some of the things at the Council of Governments that we already do are that research analysis and planning side of things that the cities are really interested in. For example, we'd like to know, what are different cities doing to manage scooter parking? Or what are some of the best practices for equity programs and outreach to low income and disinvested communities? And they are so busy with managing the day-to-day operations of these systems, keeping operators compliant, dealing with public calls about parking issues, that they don't have time to necessarily do all that research and analysis on what are the best practices. And so that's a high value that taking a regional approach can bring the same information to all partners and help with decision making and collaboration. And then there's also a value to providing a seamless user experience. In the cities of Sacramento and West Sacramento are only divided by a river. In a lot of metro areas, it would actually be the same city. You're just crossing a bridge and then you're in a different city. And from the user perspective, if you have different requirements around where you want people to park the devices, for example, one city maybe wants them to be parked at a bike rack, and another one is like, just, lock it to a stop sign or wherever. That's going to be confusing to implement, right? Because users aren't necessarily going to know that there are different rules in the different cities. Or if they do, they might forget which is which. And there's also something on the operator side, right, of having similar ordinance requirements for the operators can help with that seamless user experience too, because the information that they're pushing out could be the same to whatever cities are in that broader metro area. And then another big thing that SACOG has focused on is streamlining procurement processes. So I mentioned, we did the initial procurement for a regional bike share system, and we are also looking at doing another one this year. We're coming up on an option to either extend our agreement with Lime, or we could think about what are our other options. And so we want to get as much information from the marketplace about what might a broader shared micromobility system look like. And so we're again leading the way on developing an RFP that could potentially be used even broader than the initial 3 cities that were involved. We have a lot of suburban jurisdictions that have expressed interest over the years about wanting scooters and or bikes. And could we structure this agreement in a way that gives them the ability to potentially have contracts with a vendor that is out of one procurement process, rather than cities having to all do their own procurement processes. And this isn't unique to Bikeshare. For our region, we've done a lot of regional procurements for like fuel for our member fleet vehicles. So that's definitely of high value to our city and county members. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on is data sharing, which is a good transition to Emily's presentation. They're doing a lot here. It's really impressive. But having a data dashboard has been really helpful for our city partners to be able to see all the scooter and bike information in one portal. And it helps SACOG as well. I get asked from our data and modeling team all the time, like, oh, do you have information on trips and routes? And maybe we could use that for some off-model calculations for our long-range plan. So there's lots of use cases for it. And I think that, again, it just speaks to the value of having a regional approach instead of each city and each agency having its own data portal, that you have something shared, that it just has the economies of scale. It's cheaper to procure one thing and have a tiered cost share that goes with that. So we are now at a space, as I mentioned, that we're asking ourselves, what do we want Bikeshare to look like in our region? And starting to think about, should we have a more regional approach to just shared micromobility overall? So it's been a really exciting space to work on, and I look forward to letting you all know how it goes later this year as we collect more information about what the marketplace is willing to bring to the Sacramento region, and see what our next 5 to 10 years looks like. And with that, I will stop sharing and turn it over to Emily or Amanda.
Oh, yeah. Well, I just want to say, Sabrina, thanks so much for providing that overview of the work that SACOG has done and teeing up the conversation around data sharing that I know Emily is going to jump into a little bit more. I have noticed just that there are a couple of questions that have started popping up, and I just want to make sure everybody knows that we will have plenty of time for questions, but we'll just let Emily present and then we'll jump into your questions. And also, sorry, I made a note for myself, the second highest market globally for jump behind Paris. Amazing. I have questions. Okay. Emily, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you, everybody. All right. All looks good on your end?
Looks great.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. This is such a pleasure to get to chat with Sabrina and folks from Urbanism Next about the regional role in shared micromobility. I think there are a handful of folks that I feel like are deep in this world. So it's always really exciting to share this with a broader audience and get a chance to hear more about what other folks in the regional space are doing. We're always so inspired by the work that SACOG is doing. They've been doing this for a while, as you saw. So it's always exciting to see what innovative programs they are coming up with. But I'm Emily Lindsay. I'm from the Denver Regional Council of Governments. It's also called Dr. COG, if you hear that acronym throughout my presentation. That's what I'm talking about. I'm in our Transportation Planning and Operations Division. And just to give everybody a quick little what's what here in the Dr. COG region, we have a pretty large MPO area. If you're familiar with Colorado, it truly is a peaks to plains region. If you see the western part of this map, you'll see the Loveland Pass, basically, and then out east into the plains. But we are kind of sandwiched in between two other urban areas, Fort Collins to the north and Colorado Springs to the south. But we have 58 different member governments throughout the Denver region, all with very diverse planning, land use, demographic contexts, ranging obviously from our urban core in Denver up to tiny little mountain communities and some small and medium-sized suburban communities. So there is a little bit for everything. And I think that's an important context to keep in mind when we think about micromobility at the regional level. I think it means a lot of different things across our communities. Just to give folks a quick insight into how our MPO kind of organizes our functions, because I feel like a lot of folks here, oh, I didn't know MPOs did this, right? So I wanted to give folks just an idea of how we have organized our Transportation Planning and Operations Division. We have a Mobility Analytics and Transportation Operations team. Those are the folks that work with our travel demand model. And actual operations of the roadway. We have a long-range planning team, project programming and delivery team that works with our TIP, and then my program, which is active and emerging mobility, that really focuses kind of on active transportation and kind of innovative mobility, which is how we're kind of talking about this today. So like Sabrina mentioned, while we don't operate a shared micromobility program, we do play a big role in the data sharing within the region, making sure that that is accessible to member governments and now to the public. So while we didn't get started in 2016, like some folks, we really were having ad hoc conversations about dockless Bikeshare as we saw them come and go through the region, and we kind of realized we need to have a more established way to talk about this. There's obviously some shared regional needs that we are seeing throughout the region in terms of having specific needs for tools, expertise, policies. So we established a formal micromobility work group in the region in early 2019. At that point in time, we hadn't seen e-scooters in the region or dockless e-bikes, so it was good time to get together. Dr. Cog also joined two kind of national mobility data conversations to kind of help us get oriented and figure out what the best role is for a regional agency to play. We've participated in Open Mobility Foundation and SA's Mobility Data Collaborative since 2019. I think it's just been really helpful to see what cities, what MPOs, and other agencies are doing in the space around shared micromobility data specifically. And so there's also, just for some context in Colorado, we also have an electric vehicle coalition, and they have established a micromobility subgroup. So Dr. Cog leads the shared micromobility committee under that group, but we realized, we can't do a ton until we know what's going on. So we completed an inventory basically of shared micromobility programs throughout the state and including the Denver region to give folks just an idea of what is happening. I think this really helped contextualize our conversations about the types of programs, the types of devices that were kind of throughout the state and especially in the Denver region. And so I'm happy to drop a link into the chat for this. But I think one of our major products and conversations was around shared micromobility in the region. What does it mean for local agencies? What does it mean for regional consistency? I think, like Sabrina mentioned, there are some things that local agencies are going to be much more concerned about in the day-to-day operations, whether that's making sure sidewalks are accessible, making sure that vehicles are operating safely. And then at the regional level, I think there were some also considerations that emerged, just trying to better understand how this fits into our transportation system, some of the kind of analytics on the side about how this relates to transit, other modes. And so we really went through each of the different areas where we could collaborate. And we prioritized those policy areas for actual action, right? Like this was at early days, and we wanted to know where we could best kind of serve our member governments and our stakeholders in the region. And so overwhelmingly, micromobility data was the top of everyone's list. They said we need a consistent regional approach. And so we heard that loud and clear and worked with local member governments, our state DOT, our local transit agency to develop different use cases. And I think those really varied across those different agencies. Obviously seeing use cases from local agencies being really focused on managing kind of the day-to-day of programs. Regional agencies like Dr. Cog, we were of course interested in kind of that more aggregated data across the region. So throughout the region, looking at origins, destinations, routes, our Travels and Band model team also was interested in some of this information. I think just getting some of that basic info is really novel because we haven't always had access to easy information from an active transportation perspective. So it really does help inform some of those off-model calculations. And then along with our state DOT and our regional transit agency, RTD, we also wanted to hear, what could you guys do with this data? How can you better kind of manage your right-of-way and your station areas and better understand how this fits into the ecosystem? So working alongside all those partners, we evaluated a couple different options on how we could meet those use cases. And we conducted basically a selection process early on for a micromobility data platform We selected Ride Report in February 2020. What a time. And we really wanted to have this regional approach, right? So and these tools at the time were really focused on local agency implementation. So I think we kind of had to get creative about thinking how access to information, the different dashboard views, how you kind of aggregate the data at a meaningful level for the regional and state agencies participating. And currently we have 5 local cities that are participating alongside the 3 regional agencies, Dr. Cog, CDOT, and RTD. And we've set up the program such that we can add folks as programs come online, which is really a benefit for our local agencies, that they don't have to go through this procurement process. We have developed a pretty simple letter of intent process, so there's no complicated IGAs, MOUs that typically kind of enter the transportation planning space. So it's really easy to join as programs come online, and we've seen the program grow consistently since 2020. And I think just one of the things that I really wanted to highlight is some of our kind of lessons learned from this process so far. We are in our 2nd year of the program, almost the 3rd year. And Dr. Cog holds the regional agreement. I think this is something we wouldn't change. This really enables that kind of multi-agency, cross-jurisdictional approach that we really like and think is successful. But I wanted to highlight that local governments still are enabling this data sharing in this project. So we need to make sure that we're communicating with partners, thinking about the elements that are important to include in policies or ordinances. Really early on, we have served as a resource to help review different data sharing policies as our local governments are negotiating with different operators or building out their own local policies, making sure you request the right data. I think, again, this is a good lesson learned. Really early on to make sure that we are including exactly what we want to use, right? Also including the clause that allows us to share this data with third parties, whether that's a platform provider, an MPO, a state DOT, a transit agency, all that good stuff. And then thinking through what metrics you want to share publicly, which leads me to kind of my last slide. So I'm gonna get some water. Which is a public dashboard. Sorry. This is made possible through a partnership with Ride Report, but it gives us this publicly shareable dashboard that has metrics for local agencies and the region as a whole. So you can use the QR code or you can also see it on Dr. Cog's website, but it really allows us to track again, that aggregated regional summary level data that we can use to understand shared micromobility and how it fits into our transportation ecosystem. As you can see, the trip trends in the region, we are fully back. You can see 2019, 2020 had a bigger year, 2021, we saw some days with over 30,000 trips in the region. So just being able to have access to information like this across the region, so looking at all of the different communities, whether it is in Denver or Boulder or even the smaller town like Littleton in Arvada that have smaller programs, it gives access across the board to these tools, both publicly and kind of behind the password protected site, so that these agencies have the tools they need to manage programs on a day-to-day basis. So it really kind of benefits a range of our different stakeholders in different ways. And now we're excited because we can finally share with a little more transparency what that data kind of means and looks like throughout the region. So with that, I'm really excited to have a conversation and hear what you all think.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Emily. It's really interesting to hear about what's going on with the data collaboration and the Ride Report dashboard. I want to go ahead and just get started with questions from our attendees. I have questions as well, which maybe I'll pepper in throughout the way, but really this is more about making sure that people who are joining this morning can ask their questions. So there was one question in the chat about, for you, Sabrina, about how much SACOG worked with SAC-RT to integrate with micromobility fleets and transit. So what are the challenges there? And I'm wondering if you can speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know that this predates when I worked on the project. I didn't start managing the contract until 2018. But before that, lots of planning with SAC-RT on some station locations. At that time, we were still planning for more of a hybrid system, not a fully dockless system, where it'd be incentivized to go, people would, be incentivized to park back at certain areas. And so we were really prioritizing connections to transit with that. And then I know Uber also worked with SAC-RT to install a bunch of charging stations as well. So in retrospect, it's kind of sad though, because now the Lime bikes don't connect to those. And even the newer version of jump bikes before Uber pulled out and transitioned over to Lime, they were already transitioning to swappable batteries that they could just go around and change out the batteries on the bikes rather than picking up the bikes. And so again, it was sort of just the market continuing to evolve and change. But most of the integration was on the siting of stations and trying to connect to transit. I'm not sure if the question is talking about payment integration, which is a whole other beast. I think there are huge challenges there with when you get into mobility as a service stuff, right? And anyone familiar with that space, when you're trying to get a lot of different players into a single app, there are just some there's the logistical challenges of even just getting our regional connect card, our regional transit pass. It's how do you split up the fares and how's the money flow is one big thing. And then beyond that, if you're trying to get, Uber, Lyft, and other Bikeshare or micromobility operators in that space too, it just further complicates all of that. But I think that's one that we're continuing to watch. Places like Austin, where they have their transit provider is now also the Bikeshare provider, and really fully integrating those systems. So it's something we're continuing to work on, but I think those are some of the challenges.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. Okay, I'm going to jump over to the Q&A here. Emily, there's a question for you. Can you share more about the LOI process for new partners to join in? What information do they provide? Do they provide financial support to pay ride report as well? And is that payment adjusted by local city size?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was not going to get into this in the presentation, so I'm not sure if anyone would care. So I appreciate that question. The LOI process is super simple. And we've used this for other data partnerships and data acquisition processes. So it's not unique to this specific project. It's pretty common at DRCOG. But it is truly a letter of intent that says this community would like to join this collaborative. We will provide the data as outlined and a contribution up to whatever the dollar amount is for the program year of this. It is truly one of the more simple kind of interactions we have with our member governments. Super easy. And since the dollar amounts are pretty low, folks it's been easy to get through at the local level as well. So it doesn't take, days and days of legal review. They do provide financial support. So the first year, the program was fully funded by DRCOG. As a pilot, we just wanted to see, is this something that's worked? We also evaluated the program after the first year with the partners to say, is this worth it to you all? What do we think about this moving forward? And I think for us to get this kind of included in our annual budget in an ongoing way, we really did need to show a little bit of financial interest from the local governments. We have a very low buy-in. Cities pay $1,000 a year. Counties pay $2,000 a year. This is a very low level entry for something like this. Especially compared to the overall cost of the project, it's still DRCOG and CDOT are currently both financial partners as well. That I would say we foot the majority of the bill. But the idea is that we want to show a commitment from local agencies that this is important to them, that they do need this to manage their right of way and understand the shared micromobility programs regionally. And it allows us to have that extra support when we're going to put budget asks right in our annual budget. So yeah, so it's not adjusted by local city size, but we do adjust it by a city versus a city, county, or a county. So it kind of works out. It's also just such a low ask that folks felt very comfortable with this. Even our smaller communities were like, $1,000 is very doable for us. So.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. Okay, it looks like Sabrina, this is a question for you. What were conversations like at SACOG when SMAQMD, which I want to call SMACMD, approached and asked to manage the system? Did SACOG have enough staff resources, or was that funded by a grant?
It was funded by a grant. So that's the Sacramento Metropolitan Air Quality Management District. They were the ones that secured a grant from our funding round to launch Bikeshare. And so that grant, we just transferred to SACOG. So it did cover staff time and consultant time for planning and launching the system, as well as bike parking infrastructure. But I mean, there's still a question there, right, of the person who took over the management was working on something else. So there definitely was some like shuffling around of resources.
Thank you. And thanks for spelling out the acronym. I do enjoy, like Dr. Cog. It's so fun to say. Okay, and for all of, thanks so much. These questions are great. Keep them coming. I just want you folks who are asking questions to know I am tracking that there are some in Q&A and some in the chat. So I'm trying to go back and forth. I'm going to try and get to all of them. So I'm going to jump over to the chat. We had one from Julie. They asked, what were some of the challenges with the joint procurement process and working with multiple partners? Any recommended solutions? I think that's probably for either of you to jump in.
I think we tried to keep it super simple. Again, since we were super focused on the data element, we weren't necessarily procuring multiple products or services. Just making sure that everything is transparent and that folks that are partners of the project are brought into the selection process and can help you evaluate, I think is super important. And just being clear if there are partners that are interested, but maybe not on board yet, that they have the opportunity to learn about the products and services as well. So just like sharing information, being pretty transparent. And then, yeah. I think being flexible too, because I think the space changes really fast. So making sure that the wording in your procurement documents is flexible enough to accommodate, like if you have e-bikes and e-scooters, maybe you just want to say shared micromobility. Same thing if you're imagining other devices coming online, maybe you're just talking about shared mobility more broadly. But yeah, thinking about that, like how do you adapt in 2 years if the devices look different?
I don't know that I could add much more to that. I think that the information sharing, like we'll lead on drafting an RFP, for example, but then it's like, okay, what are we missing? Tell us what else needs to be added. Do you have any thoughts, questions, concerns? And then like Emily said, making sure folks can be part of a review selection panel if they're interested in that, so that you're just making it as collaborative and open as possible. There are times where you might have like, oh, I'd like to see this change or that. Like if you get into the minutia of it, there might be some differences. And so that's where we will try to advise on, well, let's go with this thing because it does give us like broader, we could still do the other through a specific contract negotiation for City of Davis, or, and tailor it to your needs once we get consultant selected.
Okay, jumping back over to Q&A. I see there's a question here. This is for Emily. So from the data that you shared, it seems that almost 99% of the trips are made within Denver. Does it pay off to also manage the other communities with just a handful of trips per day, or is the additional effort neglectable?
I would say from a regional perspective, that's one of the benefits of this program, is that it's easy to access for communities of all sizes, especially in our communities that have really small fleets deployed. We're talking about like, we have programs that have 100 vehicles and less. They typically have one transportation planner total, but they still need the tools to manage their right of way. They still get phone calls about misplaced vehicles. So to us, like making sure that everybody has kind of an equal playing field and access to the tools, it's really been interesting to see that our larger communities need the tools just as much as our smaller communities. Whether I feel like where we see the difference is probably on the like after analysis, kind of post-processing level data, which again, I think DRCOG is kind of playing a technical support role. So I would absolutely say it's worth it. I also want to point out Denver's program is the oldest of the programs. So they do have like the most data collected. We've even had programs come online for just like a month or two that are part of that dashboard. So we're trying to have a longer term vision, I think, to see like what happens in the region. And it gives us that ability again to kind of track those interjurisdictional trips that we wouldn't have access to if it was limited to a single kind of city jurisdiction.
That's a great point. And being able to just visualize that data in different places, it seems so helpful. Sabrina, you touched on the challenges of operating bike share after the emergence of e-scooters. Has that experience given rise to any strong recommendations for providing multiple micromobility services in the same area?
I mean, I'm not sure I'm totally understanding the question, but it's definitely added to conversations about what does that mean for managing a lot of different operators and the challenges that some of the cities have had with that dynamic is really where our discussions have gone, is like, is there some benefit to having fewer operators in order to get a little more like public ownership of the system, in the sense that the cities are responsible for responding to the public and the right of way and the safety concerns. And so and equity is a high priority. And so how do we make sure that those policy goals are achieved while also not having a huge cost to the cities in terms of standing up a publicly owned system can be very expensive.
And it sounds like actually, I mean, my interpretation too, based on the discussion and what you mentioned at the end, is that you're looking at the next RFP being about shared micromobility services more broadly at the regional level. Is that right? Yeah,
exactly. I mean, I will say that there are some of us, myself, who's partial to bikes. I don't care for scooter, like as a user, I'd rather ride a bike than a scooter. But the scooters are, just from the data that we're seeing from the North American Bikeshare and Scooter Share Association and other survey work that other regions have done, scooters are providing a different use case and providing an option for users who don't necessarily want bikes. I work with people who are like, oh yeah, I'd way rather ride a scooter than a bike. So from that lens, it's like, well, let's maximize our opportunity to reduce car trips, provide more mobility options by making sure we have as many of the, and if there's, sit down scooters that come out and other device types, I'm sure there's going to be more innovation in this space. How do we ensure that we're providing as many options to people to allow them the opportunity to drive less?
Yeah, I think that actually is an interesting segue into another question here that's about how do you balance, control / incentivize the ratio of scooter share to bike share offerings? And you kind of touched on this already. Is there a usage difference between scooters versus bikes, or benefits from one mode to another? I'm curious, just based on where you are in the process, have you started talking with the member jurisdictions about what the balance or incentivization structure of the ratio could look like?
Well, that's one of the things that we're hoping this procurement over the summer will help with, is we want to see what the different options are for how a system could be set up that is more holistic to scooters and bikes. We have talked about, we see that the bikes are used for an average of 2-mile trips compared to an average of 1-mile trips. And so if you start thinking about, okay, where should we place the bikes where they could be used for these longer trips that are maybe farther from the downtown grid, and then having more scooters in the grid, but not that you wouldn't have any bikes, but that's where we're starting to think about it, is how do we place the devices in the areas that make most sense for the infrastructure that's there and the types of trips that people are already using them for.
Emily, is that something that's come up in Denver with your member jurisdictions?
For sure. I think we've seen, especially the city and county of Denver, lost its station-based bike share system in 2020. I'm sorry, what is time? And so folks were really, bummed about that because they use those bikes to get around the community. And so making sure that e-bikes were part of the fleet mix was really important to the city and county of Denver. So they actually have a minimum requirement for out of the whole fleet that a certain percentage of them has to be e-bikes. I think also it's been really interesting to see local governments play a role in, separately from shared micromobility, but play a role in encouraging private e-bike purchases, whether that's through rebate programs or grant programs. So I think just having the visibility of having e-bikes out on the street, giving people a chance to try them out, has really increased that interaction and engagement from citizens about how do we make this an affordable transportation option for me to replace my car on a day-to-day basis. So outside of the shared kind of ecosystem, I think it's really opened people's eyes just about the different devices that they can incorporate into their everyday lifestyle. So I think that's been an interesting thing to watch happen in the Denver region for sure.
Okay, I see. This is a heady question. So Uber's business failure underscores the risk of bike and scooter share as a business. Transit integration seems critical to viability and public value. How can regional agencies help move the needle from arm's length private operator contracts to long-term consistent service provision like traditional transit?
I love this question. That is, one of the reasons that we're doing a procurement this year is because we've been having a lot of discussions about what the finances are behind these systems and the public benefit that they have, and the need to think about them more like public transit. If we're seeing that they're not financially viable on their own, and we have these policy goals of connecting to transit, reducing car trips, providing more equity in access to transportation options, providing civic amenities to our community members, then we need to think about, well, that's probably something that's going to need public investment. And so we are interested in exploring what the operating models might be that would give us more of those public policy outcomes that we're after. And if that turns out to be more of a publicly nonprofit owned and operated system, then what does it take for us to create that system in terms of sponsorship dollars or ongoing public subsidy? That's the type of information that we want to bring back to our elected officials for them to be able to make an informed decision.
That's a really good point about tying it back to your civic outcomes, because I think each agent or each local government is really interested in specific outcomes that they've outlined, whether that is increasing the access to these devices, maybe it's increasing the equity component, maybe it is really focused on that transit connection. But I think we've seen, like I mentioned, services come and go, and I think that provides a shock to people in realizing the permanence of some of these kind of private operators coming into the public right of way. We have seen bike libraries continue to grow in the Denver region that are managed by nonprofits or even local cities. So they want to continue to play that role in making sure that people have mobility options, like shared micromobility, whether or not that is provided by a private operator or it's provided by the municipality. And I think we've seen too with the new federal transportation legislation is that we've seen shared micromobility enter the eligibility space. Typically, before this, we were allowed to pay for capital costs only. There was no operating money available, no kind of startup ability to make sure programs were viable before the funding ran out. And now we've seen, right, that we can use public dollars to finance some of these programs. So it will be interesting to see if local governments would like to take that on, to see what role maybe nonprofits or TMAs can play in the space, because they typically have run a lot of the bike libraries that we have in the region. But yeah, it is kind of like a play. And I mentioned that we've even seen local governments like City and County of Denver are offering $400 to $1,200 rebates for for people in the city and county of Denver to go buy a personal e-bike, right? Like we have seen just like that encouragement and emphasis on thinking about your transportation habits, whether that's in a shared system or whether that's a privately owned vehicle. So I feel like, again, it's just like thinking about what is right for the community based on what their stated needs are.
I think that makes a ton of sense, connecting it back to those higher level outcomes that we want ultimately, or that we're trying to get to. So there's another question here. This is something that certainly that's been on my mind, and I know that Sabrina, we've talked, I think, a little bit about this. So what are some of the challenges and possible solutions that you've seen or considered for micromobility services being successful in typical lower density suburban environments versus more densely urbanized and or high attraction environments? Downtown urban centers, university communities, resort locations, et cetera. And yeah, really curious about this one, especially since I know that there's a variety of different jurisdictions that have expressed interest in seeing services come to their location or to their communities.
Yeah, I think it's one that hasn't been thoroughly tested in a lot of markets in terms of many of the more suburban examples that come to mind have a university. So there's like some portion of the service area that gets some density of ridership that kind of supplements the system overall, where you might otherwise have like a smaller city just by itself trying to do bike share or scooter share. That's probably going to need to come in with some level of subsidy to make that pencil out for even a private operator who might otherwise go into a place like City of Sacramento and not charge it any kind of subsidy, and they, they're even paying fees to be there. So I think the challenge is figuring out what's maybe a smaller geography, a downtown, a main street, because even small towns have a main street, right? If you have some level of infrastructure investment around bike lanes or trails, I think that could make a big difference in terms of how successful a system could be. But then testing with the smaller geography and then seeing like, okay, do we have enough ridership to grow this larger? But then also recognizing that you might do a pilot and that the ridership's not there, and it's either you are going to pay a lot higher subsidy to make it work, or it's something that just doesn't pencil. But I like the other models you might think about are like those lending libraries that Emily mentioned, or can you subsidize personal bikes in, if the community is really small and doesn't have the ridership to support that, like an ongoing shared system.
And just generally, I feel like we've seen in our communities, like Littleton is a great example. They really did a focused pilot around their downtown. There's a transit stop nearby. Like I mentioned, it's less than 100 vehicles. And I think part of the reason they were able to do that is they said, we'll just select a single operator to come. And I think that makes it more obviously attractive to the operator to say, oh, we're going to be the only player in the market. So, I mean, that might be a consideration if you're not getting a lot of interest, but also considering your goals in lieu of fees, right? Like if your goal is to increase access in certain equity areas, like instead of charging fees to operate, you can think about subsidizing, you'll ask the operator to subsidize rides that start and end in these zones, right? So we've seen things like that too, that seem attractive to operators to say, right, like you're not coming in and paying us, but we're just providing a break on some of these different types of trips.
I'll add, just because I'm doing some research on shared micromobility programs across the country, and I've been collecting all of these RFPs and program requirements and operating agreements and things. And I have been actually quite surprised, especially in the last couple of months, to see programs popping up in much smaller regions or smaller places, even in more what I would think are kind of more rural places. I know we have a few folks here who are listening in from the Portland region, and there are starting to be programs in places like Hermiston, which is quite small. in Eastern Oregon. And to your point, Emily, I think one of the things that I've seen as I've been looking at those programs is that they do tend to be single operator programs. Then that, that lends itself to being kind of offsetting maybe some of the things that might be more difficult as being a single player in that area. All right, I know we're getting short on time here. It looks like there's just a couple last questions. I think we're going to get through all of them. Amazing. So jumping back over to our Q&A here, I think we touched a little bit on this, but so how are you covering your program operating costs? Are partner jurisdictions paying out of pocket? Are there trip fees or other fees for operators and riders that effectively cover your program costs?
So we're providing a subsidy on just the bikes, and that is from the Air District, actually. So they are providing some local funds for that subsidy. Otherwise, we're not paying any operation costs. It's just the staff time for planning for expansion of the system and future infrastructure. Like there's more funding for bike parking that's being installed now.
Awesome. Yeah, and I know, Emily, you talked about $1,000 for the city, $2,000 for the city and county. Seems like a reasonable buy-in for access to that data or the data dashboard. Okay, there is a question here. I think that's an interesting one about just research into how many car trips micromobility may have removed from the region. Is that something, data that you are gathering, or are you using the data that you're getting in the dashboard to kind of think about like what trips those might have replaced?
Yeah, we have some UC Davis, ITS in our region. We benefit from having them close by. They have done some research on the Bikeshare system, a couple different surveys. And so it's not perfect in that it's not statistically valid household travel data, survey data, but it does align with national survey results where people are asked, if you, what mode would you have used if you didn't use Bikeshare or scooter? And it tends to be about a third of the trips replace car trips. And that's what we've seen in our region too. So that could be like a TNC car trip, or a drive alone trip is, considered a trip reduction. And then we use that to then estimate, okay, we're seeing this number of total trips. And so this is how many car trips have likely been reduced from that. But it's kind of a moving target in the sense of like, that was all pre-pandemic. So now, I don't know, there might be like much more happening on the recreation side and less trip reduction. So you got to keep going back and asking. And one, I should note, the city of Sacramento is going to be requiring operators to do an annual survey of users. So that should help collect some of that data in a more ongoing, timely way.
That's great.
Yes. We've seen the same, around, I think 31% was the latest survey, and that was done through Intercept in the city and county of Denver. So we haven't done a regional survey, but we can use obviously Denver's triple replacement estimates to estimate what we've seen region wide. We've almost seen, 10 million trips in the region. So, I mean, roughly 3 million of those we think have replaced taxi, Uber, driving a personal vehicle, like those kinds of trips.
That's really exciting. Well, we're about 2 minutes to the hour. I just want to see if there's any parting thoughts, anything that hasn't come up that you want to make sure you have an opportunity to mention before we call it a morning here.
I just want to say thank you. I feel like if there's any other regional agencies out there, feel free to reach out and ask questions. I learned so much from colleagues like Sabrina all the time. So don't be shy if you're curious or want to follow up. I know I'm here at least to answer any of those questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having us, Amanda. I definitely agree with Emily that, would love to hear from other folks who are in this space. That's one of my favorite things, is just peer sharing what's going on and, help each other do even more.
100%. Yeah, I so appreciated both of you taking the time to share your insights, and the work that you're leading is really impressive. So I look forward to continuing to keep an eye on both of your regions. And thanks to you all for joining this morning. There were so many great questions. So thanks so much. And we will be sending an email with the webinar out. So if anybody is wondering about that, that will be forthcoming. And thanks again. Have a great day wherever in the world you may be. Take care.
Thank you.